Okay.
Okay, well, first, thank you all for making time for this meeting today. Welcome. This is the Project Evaluation Subcommittee, the Technical Advisory Committee for the Master Plan development for Virginia. Our only agenda item today is a presentation on the raft, but before we can do that, there are some materials that we have to go through to allow this meeting to proceed. So let me call this virtual meeting of our subcommittee together. And as you can see on the screen here, text that we've been provided that public bodies are generally prohibited from meeting electronically under provisions of the Freedom of Information Act. However, emergency language approved by the Governor and General Assembly in April allows us to move forward with certain restrictions that I'll outline in a moment. First, let me review how this meeting will work. We want to allow for full participation by subcommittee members, staff, and members of the public who wish to comment. However, it's essential to be able to manage this conversation effectively. So the meeting will be open for subcommittee members' comments at any time. For those members of the public and or others who wish to make a comment, we ask you please do so in the chat box. And Josh Sachs, who is our staff for this subcommittee, will be monitoring that to let us know when someone submitted a comment, and we'll address those comments as time allows. And we will move to there we go. So I have to read this introduction before we can really get started. Chapter 1289 of the 2020 Acts of Assembly, also known as the Budget Bill, includes language addressing the ability of public bodies to conduct public electronic meetings without the need for a quorum being present in a single physical location. This language is submitted as an amendment by the governor and approved by the General Assembly at their April 22nd, 2020 reconvened session. The governor subsequently signed the budget bill, and the bill was effective as of July 1st, 2020. The budget bill allows public bodies to hold electronic meetings when the governor has declared a state of emergency pursuant to Section 44-146. The nature of the declared emergency makes it impracticable or unsafe for the public body or governing board to assemble in a single location. Purpose of the meeting is to discuss or transact the business statutorily required or necessary to continue the operations of the public body and the discharge of its lawful purpose, duties, and responsibilities. The budget bill also has language regarding recordings and transcriptions of electronic meetings, so please be advised that this meeting is being recorded. The recording will be available through the Secretary of Natural Resources website. The comments in the chat room will also be preserved as a public record. Official minutes of the meeting will be drafted, posted in accordance with regular procedures. Minutes will also include the type of electronic communication by means by which this meeting is being held, which in this case is WebEx. The budget bill does not allow the subcommittee to hold an electronic meeting to discuss or transact business for any purpose. Rather, they may do so as long as the agenda items that the public body plans to take up are 1, statutorily required, or 2, necessary to continue the operations and discharge lawful purposes, duties, and responsibilities. It's the committee's responsibility to determine whether the nature of the declared emergency makes it impractical or unsafe for the public body or governing board to assemble in a single location. So at the conclusion of these remarks, I'm going to ask for a motion from the subcommittee to make that determination. The motion fails. This electronic meeting will end at that point. The budget bill requires compliance with provisions of Section 2.2-3708.2. Therefore, in accordance with that section, public bodies must include a telephone number that may be used to notify us if there's any interruption in the telephonic or video broadcast of the meeting. In this case, should such a disruption occur, participants should contact Josh by phone or text at 804-690-5673. Additionally, if there's an interruption in the broadcast, the meeting must be suspended until public access is restored. So here's to hoping that Cox Communications has their act together today. Those provisions of the Freedom of Information Act not addressed by the budget bill will remain in effect. Before we continue with the business of the portion of the meeting, I'll ask Josh to call the roll for subcommittee members and staff. Other participants will be recorded through the window. If you're participating by speaking, the name is not called, please call or text Josh at that number I read before. In addition, if at any time you lose connection, unable to reconnect, please contact Josh at that same number. So Josh, do you want to run down the roster for the subcommittee? Let's see if we have a quorum here.
Yes, sir. I'm not sure if I say you or not, but I will. Dr. Hirschner,
I'm here.
Kristen Owen,
Here.
Kimberly Kane. I didn't see Kimberly. I'm just going to double check to make sure I haven't missed her in the. Okay. Shannon Alexander, Kevin Dubois. Kevin, actually, I think you are unable to, I can't make you a panelist. You may have the same issue where you need to dial in not through the web browser, as was described earlier. But Kevin is here. Whitney Catchmark.
Here.
Keith Lockwood.
Here.
Kathy McGee. Dr. McGlathery.
Here.
Randy Owen.
I think Ben Nettle is going to be here in this place.
Okay, Ben.
Present.
Mary Carson Stiff.
I'm here, and I believe Skip Stiles is also on as well.
Okay, you only get one on the, one at a time. Aaron Sutton
Here.
and Dr. Young.
I'm here.
Okay, Carl, you have quorum.
Very good. So I'm now going to present this recommended motion, and then I need a member of our subcommittee to request the motion. So the recommended motion is the Technical Advisory Subcommittee for Project Evaluation certifies that the nature of the declared COVID-19 emergency makes it impracticable or unsafe for the subcommittee to assemble in a single location, and further that the agenda items to be taken up at this meeting are necessary to continue operations and discharge lawful purposes, duties, and responsibilities of the subcommittee. So can I have a motion to adopt?
So
moved.
Second.
Did you get that, Josh?
Yes. Dr. Hirschner,
Aye.
Kristen Owen,
Aye.
Kimberly Kane, Shannon Alexander, Kevin Dubois, Whitney Catchmark,
Aye.
Keith Lockwood,
Aye.
Kathy McGee, Dr. McGlathery,
Aye.
Ben Nettleton,
Aye.
Mary Carson Stiff,
Aye.
Aaron Sutton,
Aye.
Dr. Rob Young,
Aye.
the vote carries. Meeting can continue.
All right, thank you. So here's how we're going to handle participation. Everyone except the individual presenting materials for an agenda item is going to be muted. Once the presentation is completed, subcommittee members and only subcommittee members will be unmuted for discussion, and they indicate their desire to comment by raising their hand or commenting in the box, or as we've done in the past, just speaking out. Josh will assist me in ensuring subcommittee members are recognized when they have questions or comments. Members of the public will be able to ask questions and provide input by utilizing the chat box, and as time allows, we'll respond to those questions and comments in the chat function. Public comment will be taken as the last portion of the meeting from those who signed up in advance, if anyone has. So we're now going to proceed with the business of the subcommittee as outlined in the agenda, which, as I noted, is limited today to a RAF presentation. And I'd like to start this by offering Ann Phillips an opportunity to make any comments she would like, and then introduce Elizabeth, I guess, to get this draft presentation started. So, Anne, if you would take it through.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Hirschner, and thank you everyone for attending this morning. A few quick introductions. Dewberry is joining us on the call today, just so everyone is aware of that. And more importantly for Josh, Ashley Simoneski of Dewberry is taking minutes, which will become part of Dewberry's support to the TAC and to the subcommittees. But to start off, the program manager for the contract is Dr. Brian Batten. He is on the call this morning. Johanna Greenspan Johnson, I think, is also on board. She's a resilience planner and will be working with the layout of the plan, among many other things. And I believe we also might have the owner of Vision PC, Deepa Srinivasan, who will be working with outreach, among other things. I'd also like to introduce, for those who have not yet heard of or have met him, Mr. Matt Dallin is Program Manager for the Virginia Coastal Resilience Master Plan. He is also on the call, and he is working out of DCR, but will be focused on this effort. So excellent. Many thanks to Elizabeth Andrews of the Virginia Coastal Policy Center and her students who are on board with us this morning and have spent many hours looking at developing a coastal resilience master plan, self-scoring prioritization tool, and a process by which localities might use that tool as a way to help them begin to build and understand resilience capacity and resilience planning capacity. So I know they have spoken with several of the people on the call already, a number of them, and after speaking with Dr. Hirschner, he suggests that his subcommittee might like to hear about this, and other subcommittees have joined in. So thank you all for participating this morning, and I will turn this over to Elizabeth.
Thank you, Admiral Phillips, and thank you, Dr. Hirschner. We appreciate the opportunity to present you this morning. And I want to start by introducing my colleagues. This started as an effort with Admiral Phillips talking to the RAFT project team, the Resilience Adaptation Feasibility Tool team. We'll tell you in a moment about that. My colleagues in that's a partnership between the Virginia Coastal Policy Center that I direct at William & Mary Law School and the Institute for Engagement and Negotiation at the University of Virginia, Tanya Denkla-Cobb. Dr. Wee Yusuf from Old Dominion University, unfortunately, has intermittent internet access. We can all commiserate with this. And so she's with us only through the chat box this morning. But we three are the RAF project partners, the project team. And we have been assisted in this project, in fact, led in this project by the wonderful work of 4 students. One is Carolyn Heaps, who is a UVA graduate student. And the other 3 are law students who work with me, Bryce Ballard, Abram Gagnon, and Mark Garrett. And I want to give a special shout out to law students because today is actually spring break day and they're with us. What else would you want to do on your spring break back when you were in school, right? So kudos to them for joining us. So we're here today to share a new tool and I want to stress to you that it's under development. It is not a finished product. We are here today to seek your feedback. And so it's important to note that we want to have a very full conversation about it with lots of questions asked for that very reason. This is the first time that we've rolled it out. We did try to do so at the Coastal Planning District Commission's meeting, but we ran into FOIA concerns. That was it really the business of the TAC? And so instead we sent the PowerPoint presentation and a survey to the coastal PDCs. It's really important we get their feedback. And then we are invited today to present, and we've asked if the project identification and studies, research, and best practices subcommittees want to join us as well. So we're excited to have this opportunity. I'm going to hand it over to Tanya Denkla-Cobb for a moment to talk about the history of how this evolved. Tanya?
Great. It's a pleasure to be with everybody here this morning. It's a beautiful spring. I hope you're all enjoying this spring like we're having in Central Virginia. And it is really fantastic that we're able to present this to you at this time while it's still in development. We're excited to get your feedback. So most of you may be familiar with what the RAFT is, and I'm just going to take a minute or two to briefly share what it is. It is an 18-month process that we've developed in response to needs for localities to have assistance and some kind of support in their efforts to become more resilient to coastal hazards. And so it's an 18-month process with 3 steps. The 3 steps are very distinct. The first is about 4 to 5 months in which scoring is undertaken independently by us and primarily by the Virginia Coastal Policy Center. And then at the same time, we are preparing for and working with the Planning District Commission to put together a workshop for community leaders. That is step number 2, where we will be presenting to community leaders the findings, ground truthing those findings, and then bringing it to a workshop where community leaders are creating a 1-year resilience action checklist. And then the third step is when the team, our RAFT team, works with these localities in a very, I don't want to say, it's kind of an intimate way where we are working elbow to elbow, month to month, in monthly calls with their implementation teams to find ways to help them implement their action checklists. And it could be our role is networking and finding people who can accomplish these different things. It could be that our own centers are actually doing some of the work, such as mapping or studies or creating a communication plan, for example. We always are doing this in partnership with the Planning District Commission and being invited by the localities with them in the driver's seat throughout. And with that, I hand it back to you, Elizabeth.
Great. So what happened, as the history of how we got to this point, is that Admiral Phillips went to the coastal PDCs at one of their meetings and presented about the Coastal Resilience Master Plan framework, noted that there would need to be a prioritized list of projects that came from the localities to feed into the plan. Afterwards, one of the Planning District Commission representatives, whom I won't name because it's up to her if she wants to name herself, but I will just say she's always on it. She gets it. She wrote to Admiral Phillips and said, okay, happy to help. What is the uniform process or consistent process that you'd like us to use? Is there a tool you'd like us to use to make sure that we're all looking at the same things in a consistent manner? So Admiral Phillips reached out to the RAFT team to ask about the various tools that might be available. And through the discussion, it became apparent that it would be helpful perhaps to have a Virginia-specific tool. So that's how this came about. You'll note we don't call this a RAFT tool because it's not replacing, it's not supplanting the RAFT 3-step process that Tanya just went through. It is simply a self-assessment tool to result in a prioritization of projects, resilience projects. So we're excited to have this opportunity to present, stressing again that it is not completed yet. This is the first presentation of it. It's subject to refinement based on your valuable feedback today. So please ask questions and email the students later in the week. If you have questions or additional comments, you will have a contact in the PowerPoint presentation you're about to see. We want to provide the most useful tool that we can to localities who wish to use it. Obviously, this will not be mandatory for participation in the master plan process, but our hope is that this might be deemed by the TAC, by the administration, to be the result, could be a resilience plan for the Community Flood Preparedness Fund purposes, as it would create a simple and clear path for the localities to create their plans. So we realize that's still under consideration, still under discussion. And I want to add as one final note, we are also pulling together a quick guide to resilience that could go with this as a helpful reference for localities. It would also be intended for localities not using the tool and citizens. Just a quick guide to resilience topics, largely with hyperlinks to available resources that are out there. We don't want to take up a lot of time today discussing that because we want to get your important feedback on this tool, but we're happy to discuss that at a future meeting or with some of the other subcommittees, whatever you all feel is appropriate. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our wonderful students.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, Tanya, for that introduction, and good morning to you all. I think I'm being set up as a presenter so that I can share some slides. So that's in progress, I believe. But just to start, I'll say my name is Carolyn Heaps, and Bryce Abram, Mark, and I are really excited to be with you all today, as Elizabeth and Tanya have said, to present our work developing this preliminary resilience evaluation for prioritization, or PREP, P-E-R-P tool. I'm still, okay, great. I just got the presenter notification. So let me share these slides. Great. Can you all see this? I think it looks good. Okay, wonderful. I could only advance them. There we go. So as Elizabeth shared, this group of students is designing a tool for local governments in coastal Virginia to use independently in order to assess their level of resilience to coastal hazards, as well as to identify their top resilience priorities. Today, we hope to provide you with information about the tool we're creating, including information on why we're creating it, and then also hope to stimulate some discussion around how the tool could best fit into the master planning process. We'll begin our presentation with some background information and then talk about the tool in two parts. So first, the self-assessment, and second, prioritization. And then finally, we'll draw some connections with the master plan and present some questions for your consideration. Great. So to reiterate some of what Elizabeth has already shared, this effort was born out of an identified need to understand local resilience priorities to feed into the master planning process. We understand that in some localities, resilience priorities have not been established, and so we're designing this PREP tool to help local governments in that position to identify where they can address vulnerabilities driven by coastal hazards. And as you'll see in future slides, we're approaching resilience comprehensively in this effort. We envision that this will feed into the master planning process by allowing those priorities established using the tool to be considered by the TAC and by the state as the plan is developed. We also envision that the tool will serve as a preliminary step in helping localities to apply for and receive funding for resilience needs. So again, our student team is comprised of law students from the Virginia Coastal Policy Center at William & Mary, and then I am an urban planning graduate student at the University of Virginia, and I'm working with the Institute for Engagement and Negotiation. And as Elizabeth and Tanya shared, we are collaborating closely with the RAFT team, who is advising our work based on their expertise gained during prior and ongoing iterations of the RAFT. The PREP tool is being adapted from the existing RAFT scorecard and other RAFT tools. So our approach to the PREP tool is to contextualize it in resilience best practices and other ongoing resilience work, to make it easy to use, and to tie it into the full RAFT process. To do this, our team conducted research on best practices and existing tools, documented key takeaways, and then we're integrating those takeaways into the tool's design. We also selected the Wisconsin Sea Grant Flood Resilience Scorecard as a model that we're following as we develop the self-assessment format. And beyond working with the RAFT team to ground the tool in the realities of coastal Virginia, we are meeting with members of we've already met with three subcommittee members, and we're also seeking feedback from local government staff from 3 different PDCs in the region. We're building this tool to be accessible and straightforward in recognition of the fact that many localities have limited resources to dedicate to this work, and we hope that it can assist with building capacity around resilience where needed. But importantly, we recognize that the PREP tool will not be appropriate for every locality, and especially not localities who have already completed thorough resilience plans. The tool is intended to be voluntary. And then finally, I'll say that the PREP tool will help localities who use it, again, gain a better understanding of resilience topics before participating in the RAFT. As Elizabeth said, the PREP tool is not intended to be a replacement for the RAFT. And importantly, it includes only limited community engagement, while the RAFT addresses engagement more holistically through its year of implementation support. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Abram, who is going to talk about the tool and what it will look like in more detail.
Great, thank you, Carolyn, and just thank you again for all of you for being here today to listen to our presentation and give your feedback and thoughts. And Carolyn, I'll just give you a signal when it's time to move on to the next slide. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of the physical structure of the tool, what it's going to look like in real life. And keep in mind, we tried as much as possible to align the structure with our goals and vision. something that can be easily completed by locality staff, regardless of what their capacity or resources are. So it'll be presented in a fillable PDF form that can be printed out or completed on a computer, depending on the needs of each locality. And the questions are going to be divided into sections that correlate with various substantive areas of coastal resilience policy. There'll be a total of 8 sections. Each is going to have a different area. Equity will have its own section and it'll also be incorporated throughout, because as we know, it's something that affects each and every area as well. In addition, capacity building will also be incorporated throughout. That is another one of our secondary goals with this project, is to help localities build capacity in coastal resilience issues. The locality is going to start out with a risk assessment to see what their vulnerabilities are, what physical areas or properties might be threatened by flooding, how much of the tax base is at risk from flooding. And then there will be a planning section to make sure they've completed, best practices when it comes to coastal resilience planning in their comp plan or in their capital improvement plan. And then there will be a series of more substantive sections that help them think through what their specific resilience efforts are about. For example, in emergency management, gray and green infrastructure, how they're engaging with the community. And each section is designed to be completed by the staff member in the locality who's best equipped based on expertise and typical responsibilities. And obviously the roles that staff plays in each locality is going to be different. But for example, whoever takes the lead on emergency management in the locality is going to be the best equipped to complete that section. So this design should help spread the tool out over multiple people, make it easier to complete, especially in localities where they don't have a lot of staff, and also make it less susceptible to one person's personal opinion, and spread it out over multiple people. Next slide. So I wanted to give a quick outline about how each section is going to be set up, instructions for localities. First of all, we want to make sure that localities have enough guidance to complete each section. So we're going to be supplying an overview of section, give some good links to resources so staff can look up any additional questions they have. We'll have a link to, adapt VA resources, link to the Coastal Resilience Master Plan framework, as well as the quick start guide that's Elizabeth mentioned at the presentation. Make sure that staff members are equipped to complete the section to help. Third, we'll supply a list of any resources that everyone will need to complete this, any analysis, any, the comp plan to see what is in the comp plan, whatever that may be, so they can start out on the right foot. Fourth, any key terms or definitions. I want to make sure that these are consistent throughout the process, from locality to locality, and that they're all consistent with the Coastal Resilience Master Plan framework. So we're all starting at the same place. And the real meat of this section is going to be the questions. We have a couple of examples on the right side of the slide, and this is really going to take up the main part of the section. This will be a place where localities can take stock of what they're doing on each issue in coastal resilience. Finally, there'll be a space where the locality can figure out, what do my answers mean, right? How can I quantify this number or whatever it is into something that I can use to come up with a prioritized list of actions. So part 2 of the prep process is going to be prioritization. And we can move to the next slide. And that prioritization process is going to look like staff members sitting down together and coming up with a list of actionable projects. And in order to facilitate this process, we will make sure to provide guidance for how they can interpret the results of the tool. So what does the number mean? What does it represent? How can I input that into the prioritization process? We also want to make sure that we give them a list of actionable items for each section of the tool, So if a locality can see which area we need to work on, we scored low in this particular section, well, there's a list of actions that we can take to work on that particular area. And finally, localities are going to be provided with a simple spreadsheet that will just help them prioritize their projects according to various prioritization factors. And we have a list of suggested factors. Next slide. So I want to emphasize, first of all, that these are obviously not in order of importance. This is just a list of suggested factors that the locality should take into account. Which factors are most important for each locality is up for locality to decide. And that will vary. But they all are going to affect how a locality prioritizes the projects. So first of all, how long is the project going to take? Is it realistically something that can be done in the next year or two? Or is it a more long-term project? How much does the project cost? Can it be completed using the locality's current funding streams? Does it have the potential to receive grant funding from the state, from the feds? Will it require financing, additional taxes? And then do you have the resources to complete the project in-house? Or if not, do you have the resources or the capacity to get a grant so that a consultant can come in and do the work for you? And then are you putting the cart before the horse? Are you following the proper sequence of, okay, first of all, we're going to figure out what the risk is, then we're going to prioritize, then we're going to make our planning documents, and then we'll implement. We don't want your prioritization list to necessarily be a list of things where you haven't really put in the work ahead of time. And then what is the scope of the resilience benefit to the community? So does the project mitigate risk for a lot of your residents, or does it mitigate risk for just a few, but very, very important fundamental economic assets? And then, of course, how does the project align with the principles of the Coastal Resilience Master Plan? So we're going to stress, for the localities, if you're looking for funding through this process, these are the principles that are being looked at by the state, and you need to be aligning your projects to these. And obviously, we understand that the factors for the project evaluation are still under development, and we want to make sure that's something that's integrated into the tool. And then lastly, I want to address community engagement, which is obviously a really important part of planning and prioritization. And it's something that, for example, the raft does very, very well. But we've kind of made the decision that with the time crunch that's happening in this whole process, it would be unrealistic to include a mandatory community engagement requirement. But we do encourage any localities who can to include as many people as possible in this process. We'll be linking to the gaps analysis that the Community Outreach Subcommittee is conducting to help facilitate that. And it is our understanding that the master plan is meant to be iterative. So that means when localities are completing prioritization lists in the future, hopefully they're not under the same time constraints that they are today, and they'll be able to do a proper community engagement process. Next slide. So we've been very fortunate to receive a lot of feedback on the tool itself and the structure of the tool from some of the subcommittees that we met with and from some of the PDC staff. And so what we're looking for today is really your feedback and hopefully a discussion of some of the big picture questions. How is this going to fit into the larger Coastal Resilience Master Plan process? How is it going to be used by the state, by the TAC? What's the role of the PDCs in the implementation process? Next slide. And I did want to mention for any of the PDC staff that are here at the meeting today, if you do have any feedback on this whole project, any of the questions here, please make sure to respond to the Google form that we sent you. I believe the deadline is this Friday. And if someone could put that in the chat, that would be great. Just a link to that. Next slide. So these are just a few of the questions that we've been thinking about, and some of the questions that we've heard from, you know, some of the TAC members that we've spoken to. We'd love to hear your thoughts if you have the time today. And obviously, you know, we realize there probably aren't clear answers to a lot of these questions right now, but their resolution is important to the development of the tool. So we welcome your ideas and suggestions, any questions you have, particularly around, you know, how are these prioritization lists going to be considered for inclusion in the master plan, and also, you know, how can we ensure that the priorities put forward by the localities are eligible for funding sources? What is the, I guess, sort of the carrot for having localities do some kind of resilience self-assessment in the first place, and things like that. So I will hand this, I guess, back over to Carl, and we'd love to hear your feedback on these questions and also answer any other questions that you might have. And again, just thank you for being here and thank you for listening to our presentation.
Thanks, Abram. And so just starting, Carolyn, thank you. Just to start, the first reaction I have is a request, which is, at what point are you going to be able to share the current status of the prep tool? That is, the questions, the specifics that are in the various sections.
So we, our plan is to have this kind of internally reviewed and ready to send out to the localities who we've identified to help us kind of test some of the questions. So we've identified some locality staff representatives to look at some of the questions with us and give us feedback. And that process we are hoping to have going probably in the week of like April 19th or so. But, you know, realistically speaking, unfortunately, we have a pretty limited amount of time left in our semester. So that's kind of a constraint that we're working with in terms of trying to get a really solid final product turned around, which could be tweaked if necessary by others after we graduate. But we're really kind of constrained by finishing up by May 14th at the latest is kind of when I am, when the semester ends.
So
yeah, they're inconsiderately graduating, Carl. You know, what can I do?
yeah,
So,
I know.
so I think, though, as Carolyn noted, that doesn't mean that the RAFT project team won't continue to try to develop and improve this as we go along. And as Carolyn noted, there are going to be, and Abram, that there are going to be future iterations of this plan, I hope, past this year. So it'll be important to figure out eventually, where is this going to be housed, for example, so that we know about updates to it to reflect the master planning process as well.
So the reason I ask is, the sooner you can share even your initial ideas for the questions that localities might be directed to consider, the better it will be for our project evaluation subcommittee, because we are on a path of trying to identify metrics which might be used to look at projects and see how they conform to the 5 guiding principles in the master plan framework. And to the extent that we can react to what you are currently thinking about or asking localities to think about, the goal would be to move as closely as we can to a consistent process where the prep tool guides localities to assemble and consider certain information, which then turns out to be the same information that we are recommending, would be recommending to the TAC as the criteria for deciding if a project is, suitable for consideration under the master plan and the funding for the master plan. So, we would like for this, I would like for this to be a two-way street as quickly as possible moving forward. And because our subcommittee is also on a timeline, we aren't going out of existence in May, but we do need to get something to the TAC probably by June or July. And so, again, if you can share your preliminary thinking so that we can begin to work with that and respond to it, that would be most helpful.
Got it. And I'm putting in the chat box to everyone. Abram had asked if we could put the link to the form. Evidently it doesn't copy a hyperlink. So here's the full link. And that was one that the students have pulled together to get feedback from PDCs at the March 30th meeting where we ended up not being able to present. But we're collecting feedback from the PDCs there in particular, trying to figure out, and we'd love the subcommittee's feedback on that. What is the role of the PDCs that everyone foresees in this process, working with localities?
You are inviting us to shoot ourselves in the foot?
No.
So let me just open this up to the other members of the subcommittee if any of you have questions or comments at this point. Rob, I see you have come to life here on my screen.
Yeah, well, if this weren't COVID times, it would be great to come up and hang out with you guys for a couple of days to talk about this, because I think, there's a lot to talk about. But I'll try and restrict my thoughts to just a couple of things here. And if you'd like to follow up with a conversation afterwards, I'm happy to do that, assuming we're allowed to. I don't know how all these complicated things work these days, but somebody will have to tell me if that's possible or not. But it seems to me that the crux of a lot of this will be having a good vulnerability assessment, so that you have a common basis for everyone to understand the different degrees of vulnerability for whatever asset it is that you're trying to protect. And in addition, it's important that everyone has the same understanding of what the word vulnerability means and what a good vulnerability assessment should contain. Because I work with a lot of different localities, counties, and people have a wide variety of concepts of what a vulnerability assessment would be. For some of them, it's just looking at their FEMA flood insurance rate maps, right? And that's their basic understanding of the vulnerability of their community. And as most of us probably know, the flood insurance rate maps are uniformly not good in most places. They're very problematic. Also, a lot of people will just look at a sea level rise inundation layer or maybe some slosh modeling or something like that as a way to help understand their vulnerability. But, we really need to have good guidance for people marching down this process for what a vulnerability assessment should include. And, I'd really love to see the state of Virginia endorse one sort of uniform process for assessing vulnerability so that you can compare from one locality to another a vulnerability score, or from one county to another, from one PDC to another, so that decision makers have a uniform way to understand the vulnerability of different assets, buildings, roads, bridges, or something like that. And there are a lot of localities that don't have the capacity to do that kind of a vulnerability assessment. So that's the issue, right? And for us, a vulnerability assessment needs to include a very good understanding of the exposure. Let's just take a building exposure to hazards, so sea level rise, storm surge, coastal erosion, but also the sensitivity of that structure when the water gets there. Is it elevated? You know, when was it constructed? So anyway, so my first thought is, you know, how does actually getting these vulnerability assessments done interface with the process that you've created? Because it seems to me like that's the first step. It's a really important step. We need to be creating a uniform way for that to get done. For those that don't have the capacity to do it, we need to help them get them done. And there needs to be funding. And one last thought on the vulnerability thing. In your slide showing prioritization factors, vulnerability wasn't listed. And maybe you have it sort of incorporated into one of the other categories, but certainly the exposure to hazards and the sensitivity of the asset that you're looking at has to be an important prioritization factor for anybody who's considering what to fund. It may be the most important facility in your locality, but if it's not vulnerable, then we don't need to prioritize it for funding. So, you know, I'm curious why that wasn't explicitly at the top of the list of prioritization factors. And I think this vulnerability assessment discussion, you know, it may be separate from the task that you're completing right now, but it's certainly a critical component of marching down that resilience pathway that you're trying to build, is to first have that vulnerability assessment. And, you know, I'd really like to see us define it well, give everybody an idea for what should be included in a good vulnerability assessment, and maybe have the state sort of endorse a uniform approach. So now I'll shut up.
Okay. Let's see. First, I don't know if Abram or Carolyn want to respond to that.
Yeah, I'd love to just share a little bit about, you know, we are definitely thinking about vulnerability assessments, and I think that is a super important part of the tool that we're creating. It's, you know, among the first recommendations that a locality will reach if they have not already done a vulnerability assessment. That will be the top priority that we give them, or the top recommendation that we give them to take a step on. And so if there is guidance provided about what that looks like, we would love to, especially if it's uniform across the state, we would love to include that in our recommendations and say, you know, this is what the state recommends that this vulnerability assessment looks like, and here's how you should go about doing it, or, you know, here's how you can go about acquiring funding to do it if you aren't able to do it on your own. So it is absolutely something that we're thinking about. I really appreciate the comment about not having vulnerability assessment as one of our prioritization factors. I think we were considering it as part of this resilience benefit to the community, but I think you're right that it should be made more explicit in that prioritization process. So we'll take that feedback to heart and take a look at that. So thank you.
So let me note that one, the vulnerability assessment that Rob's talking about clearly is something that needs some attention, and the idea of a consistent state process is wonderful. Our subcommittee is not going to get there in the first iteration of the evaluation process. And in fact, one of the reasons that the studies group with Rob Weiss subcommittee was invited to this is because this is one of the things that we would likely turn to them for some assistance in developing, as well as the Dewberry crowd, whom we've not yet had a time to meet with. But clearly, those are things that we start working on. But I'm having trouble looking for hands in the air. So are there any other questions from the subcommittee?
So Carl, this is Ann Phillips. I'll just jump in. I put something in the chat also, but I mean, this is one of Dewberry's first tasks, right, is to conduct a full coastal assessment, a risk assessment, a build to natural infrastructure. We know that we need to do more, but this will be a start at looking at more broadly across coastal Virginia and what our risks are, what's critical and what's vulnerable, and where we need to target additional work. That's one of the biggest reasons we hired a professional engineering firm to help us. We know we have a restricted timeline, so we're going to do what we can in the time that we have, but we also have capacity to move beyond that as we need to. And so, yeah, just to remind, that's why they're here.
Thanks, Ann. I hope there'll be an opportunity for us to interface with them early on about how about that approach and how that's going to happen.
So I to address, I think, Elizabeth's questions about the PDC's role. I mean, I think one piece that could be helpful is, we haven't sat down with our localities and asked them who is very comfortable, approaching these things at a local level and managing their own contract, who would like to see things done, assessments, vulnerability or otherwise, done at a regional or state level. I hear what you're talking about, trying to do something consistent, but I think there may be a need for some flexibility, because when you think about different localities approaching this, a lot of them are going to work with consultants and they have different suggestions, right, about how you might tweak an assessment. I don't know that we want one and only one, tool to do this work. And I'm not talking about, prep, but I just mean even the vulnerability assessment. So I think maybe that's one next step. And then when you talked about finding funding for people, you'd have a better idea of what's of interest. Do people just need the grant, or do they need someone to be like a project manager?
Let's see. Is there a reaction, or if not, other comments?
Carl, could I respond to what Whitney just?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Whitney, yeah, this is a voluntary tool. It's not mandatory, and some localities may choose to do things a different way. What we were hoping to do was really to help localities that might be newer to this discussion, newer to these concepts, to make sure that they are under the umbrella of resilience, thinking about everything, not just their primo infrastructure, as Rob noted, right? That there are a lot of things that go into that, and making sure that they think of all the various aspects of that. But the self-assessment, the vulnerability assessment, really, that's a big lift in and of itself, as Carl knows, right? So this is to help get them over the line of prioritizing the projects to get back to the state. So it's not just when the question comes, what do you want to fund? You know that there's a lot of things you want to fund, but you don't really know precisely what they are and how to prioritize them. It gives them a basis to work from.
Okay. Any other comments or questions from the subcommittee? Mary Carson.
Hi. I have a question about what the outcome is. So what is the product that the locality receives once they complete the prep? Can you talk a little bit more about that resource and how it can be used and reused and modified and transformed, especially if it is intended to serve as the resilience plan for the community flood preparedness fund? I think that making that link would be helpful, because then we'll have some idea of how, as TAC members, we're supposed to think about it and think about the flood fund in the future for coastal communities.
I can take this one, if that's all right. So yeah, I mean, hopefully coming out of this, the locality will have a score for each, section of the tool, and also a representation of what does that mean for them, some kind of interpretation. What the actual outcome for the locality or output for the locality is going to look like, I think that's something that we would actually like to hear from the subcommittee about, in terms of what specifically would your team want from the localities. We've kind of been envisioning a prioritized list of projects, very simple. But yeah, I mean, I think that's something that we would obviously like feedback on.
And if I could just jump in here for a second and just clarify. So this subcommittee is asking for input and things from the RAPT or the William and Mary group, but not in any way responsible for providing feedback for its products, for the William and Mary products. Should they like to, you can, but that's not what this, do you understand what I'm trying to say here?
Yeah, kind of, but I will say that one of the reasons for having this presentation, one of the objectives that at least I have for trying to move forward here is to make the prep tool and whatever we end up with as evaluation criteria, what the project ID subcommittee comes up with as characterization metrics, all as consistent as possible so that there is as little confusion as we can manage and as much consistency between all the things that are available to help and guide and or assess localities' efforts to participate in master planning. So yeah, I do hope that we will, as our subcommittee, be able to send information back to the prep tool, the RAFT group, for consideration in any future iteration of that tool.
Sure. I would just say your number one charge is to advise the state on state actions.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And that's why I think we don't really expect the prep tool to be nothing more than the evaluation that we would be interested in, because there will be reasons for localities to prioritize things, to have an interest in activities that the state may not wish to participate in or have as its own set of priorities. But to the extent that the prep tool can inform an assessment of the project, the various projects, incorporation or conformance with the guiding principles in the master plan, our effort will be well served.
Very good. Carl, there is a question in the chat from Kevin. May I read that now?
Yes, please.
Since DoD facilities are often whole communities within localities with their own management plans for infrastructure and natural resources, how do you envision PrEP to work for DoD? Would they be a part of the locality's response or have their own? Should a JLUIS or cooperative plan for project cost sharing and implementation be part of the prioritization factors?
Elizabeth, Tanya?
Yeah, I was going to jump in unless Tanya wants to. I can't see her. Are you jumping in?
No, I actually would love to have that reread. I missed the first part of it.
How will you work with military installations?
Yeah, Kevin's asking if DoD installations within communities will be treated separately or if we do it together, like a JLUIS concept, working to joint land use study concept. And I will just say that we have not gotten to the point of having a separate tool for the military. Traditionally, other than the JLUIS process, as you all know, especially Kevin, there's been a lot of very separate paths. Even when we did the cost of doing nothing study at VCPC back in 2016, right? The military data was very separate from what was available to us from the other communities. So that is something that I would say would be a next iteration. The goal at this point, when this situation arose and was raised to our attention, and that's one thing to keep in mind, Josh, in response to your comment, that this is not that we thought this was a great idea and decided to come to y'all. This was something that kind of bubbled up through a PDC meeting. And so we want it to be as helpful as it can be, right? We don't want to just go off and create this thing that won't help anyone and sits by itself. But it will have to be probably multiple iterations. And I would say that a military aimed one would be a next iteration. It's not, we're just trying to get over that hill now of doing it for localities that want to do it.
Hey, Elizabeth, would this iteration also try to consider projects on private property?
Yeah, Louis asked me that question as well earlier, and I guess it could be. We have been thinking up until this point about public projects, but a locality could be specifically instructed if you think that would be the most helpful, you being the subcommittee or subcommittees that are here today. If you think that's more helpful to include projects on private property, that could be expressly stated.
Okay, I've got both Kristen and Karen with their hands up, so let me turn to them. Kristen, do you want to go ahead?
Sure, thanks. So I have just a couple comments and a question as well, I guess. One, I'm kind of interested in knowing like what localities you've already worked with, and I'm also interested in just talking to you more about this as a locality. But I kind of taking off from what Whitney was talking about with the private property, I think it would be extremely helpful to have private property in this because most of our projects that we're going to be doing will be on private property. I mean, we could do some public property projects, but in most cases, we're not going to be able to, or we're going to have some kind of private partnership with that. So that's kind of the first thing. The other thing is the community engagement component, that it is optional. I have some concerns about that. I understand you're on a time crunch, but I think it would be worth having community engagement. You know, maybe you don't have time to flesh out what that whole process would be like, but making it optional, I think, will pose some problems. Hearing the answer about what the kind of output of this will be, that it's not necessarily going to be a plan, somewhat changes my feelings on that. But if I mean, if this was going to be used to try to get grant funding, whether it's on public or private properties, or if we were going to try to use it as like a component towards creating a plan, that community engagement is going to be critical because we're going to have to do it eventually anyway. And if we go through and prioritize projects with this tool with zero community engagement, that's going to derail potentially the entire process later on. So that's kind of just my comment, but I am interested more kind of piggybacking off of Mary Carson's question of like what you're envisioning this output being. It sounds to me almost like it would be one of our tools. It would not be creating a plan, but it would be one of the tools we might use in developing our plan. And along with like the vulnerability assessment that Rob was talking about, I don't see this as meeting our plan requirements, but being like one of those checkboxes that we would be looking at.
Thanks, Kristen. So yeah, I agree. I think it would be a path to a resilience plan, is I think what we're hoping for, right? As you said, the vulnerability assessment done by Dewberry, very excited to hear they're doing that first. And then this would be together, perhaps a way to get to that plan. I'm going to ask Tanya, in response to your question about what localities we worked with, if Tanya could chime in on what localities we worked with through RAP, and Carolyn could chime in with the localities you're meeting with to get feedback right now. And we would love, of course, suggestions about that too. And I'm trying to keep track of all the many questions that you had there, Kristen. There was one other one that I was going to address, but I've lost track. One was, what's this going to look like as an end result? One was what localities we worked with, and wasn't there another one in the middle?
Community engagement, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Yep.
And so community engagement is something that is a key part of full RAP, and we hate skipping it. But here's the question I would love for you all to answer. Henrico County, engaging in community engagement is a whole different ask than the town of Whitestone, Virginia, right? Which has very limited staff. And so, you know, beyond their town manager. So that's what we have to keep in the balance. That's what we have to weigh. I would love your feedback on that. All of us would. But that's something, if we make it mandatory, it could stymie the smaller towns from being able to do it at all. And so that's what we're weighing in the balance. And we're hoping that this could be a first step to funnel them to their interest into doing the full-blown RAF, where it is full-blown community engagement. So with that, I'm headed to Tanya.
Yeah, I'll start with the community engagement. I second what Elizabeth is saying. We've had that very conversation, Kristen, and are very acutely aware of how it could be problematic to create a plan without the engagement, which we believe is essential, absolutely essential. So I just second, please help us think our way through this so that it has some flexibility for people to be able to, localities to get to the point where they have something that they can start with as a starting point. And, you know, maybe it's community engagement is required at a later point. I don't know. We'd love your feedback, basically. For your question about what localities we've already worked with, we've worked with 17. We had 3 pilot communities, a city, a town, and a county, and then we moved to work regionally with 7 localities on the Eastern Shore. We're now working with 8 on the Northern Neck, and we are actually already starting with the Middle Peninsula. So, and Elizabeth, I think we have 4 there, or is it, remind me, are we doing 6 there? I should know, but.
It's about scoring on the Middle Peninsula. Yeah,
Yeah.
we're scoring the town of West Point and the counties. But I think Kristen's question might have been also focused more on which localities have you engaged with this tool, I think. So if Carolyn wants to chime in with that.
That's a different question.
Of course.
Sorry.
Right. But both, I want to cover both.
So we haven't actually sent the tool to anyone specifically yet, but we are hoping to work with 2 localities in the Crater PDC who I'm not sure have confirmed their intent to actually test, so I don't want to say exactly where yet. And then also local staff representative from the city of Portsmouth. But I think, Kristen, if this is something that you're interested in providing feedback on, we would love to engage with you around this and get your feedback beyond what you've already shared, which was incredibly valuable. So if that's something that we could follow up with you on, I'll certainly reach out.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, I think it would be worth having a conversation about and just kind of talking about the localities and making sure that there are different types of communities represented, and I agree that flexibility is needed and like what Whitney was talking about, even with PDCs, and especially because like our PDC, for instance, the communities within our PDC are very different. You know, in some of the PDCs, they're a little like the communities are a little bit more similar, and so if we did something with our PDC, it may not work as well because Henrico is very, very different from all the communities in our PDC. So kind of talking about those things. But yeah, definitely I would be interested in following up.
Okay, I am mindful of the time here, and Karen has been waiting for a while. So let's get to her. And then Josh, I need to know if there's anyone from the public who's registered to ask questions or speak. But Karen, can you go ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Carl. So I was interested in Admiral Phillips' comment about Dewberry's, one of their first tasks to do a built-in natural risk assessment. So I was interested in hearing a little bit more about that natural risk assessment, either from Josh or Admiral Phillips. And then the related question to the RAFT folks is, does the PREP tool also include natural systems, or is it really focused on built infrastructure? So interested in how those two align.
So Ann, Abram, Elizabeth.
I'll jump in. So thank you, Karen, very much for your question. We are in the process of setting up opportunities for Dewberry to begin to work with subcommittees directly to coordinate with them on areas where they need input or where they will be a part of evaluating tasks and processes as they move forward. There's quite a bit in the contract that subcommittees aren't directly aware of, and so as we move forward, how do we make them directly aware of this and have an opportunity? Starting this afternoon with the outreach subcommittee as an example. So I've seen a couple people ask me in email, can they, would they have an opportunity to work with Dewberry or to interact with them as they're working their way through this? Yes. Yes, they will, and we're moving forward to make that happen over the next few weeks. I've said that twice now, and it's been about 2 weeks since we thought we'd be able to get started there. But as you might imagine, there's quite a bit to getting a contract in place, getting all your team in place, and Dewberry's working through all that. So they're about finished that initial step, and then we'll get moving. So all of those opportunities are there, and there's some subsequent work that we also have kind of a placeholder in the contract for, because we know, again, as I said earlier, timing is a challenge here, and the first cut isn't going to be maybe what we would want from a long-term perspective. I think I'll leave it at that and let others answer other parts of Karen's question. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll add that the prep tool absolutely looks at green infrastructure and natural resources. Natural resources is a whole section of the tool, and then within the infrastructure section, we have a subsection evaluating green infrastructure and looking at that.
Okay. Josh, quickly, is there anybody registered from the public to speak?
No, there is not.
Okay, good. All right, well, we have about 15 minutes left here. And so first, let me see if there's any other member of the subcommittee or any of the other subcommittees that has a question or comment.
I'm just seeing Mary Carson's question in the chat and wanted to respond to that. I think the answer is no, there is not a streamlined process, and that's part of what we were kind of hoping to think about today with you all is how, if this seems like something that would be beneficial to informing the master planning process and your work, how can we best go about setting up the tools so that it is possible to get that feedback from localities up to the subcommittees and up to the TAC in a useful and streamlined way.
I think that would be really helpful. And if, knowing that your timeline for your semester ending and all that stuff is kind of hitting soon, I would say the sooner you survey localities and they provide information, probably the better, just because the timeline on all this is real tight. And if that information can go to Dewberry and they could find it to be very useful, then I think feeding them as much as possible is going to benefit everybody. And then obviously you saw my comments in the chat about TAC and subcommittee and stuff.
Again, I just want to continue to set the table, right? So this subcommittee has a very specific charge here, and Dewberry has a much bigger contract that works through the bigger TAC and everything. I don't want to overcommit them to anything.
So,
Thank you, Josh. And I would add, so there's a project ID subcommittee. Thank you, Carl. I know I'm stepping on you, sir. I apologize. And the project ID subcommittee is working on how do we identify projects, and then how do we collect projects that we already know are out there. And back to the timing thing, this tool, this prep concept would be something that would withstand the test of time and, in theory, help localities build resilience that would feed into a process over time. But I think we have to be careful about envisioning everybody in coastal Virginia getting this done over the next few months, and that feeding into our initial attempt at identifying projects. I'll just say it, we won't be able to get there. Okay, so that's why this is an iterative process. We start with what we have, and we show why we need to keep going with this first cut that we are doing this year.
okay, Rob, I think your hand is a new one in the crowd here.
Yeah, yes, sir. Thank you. I just wanted to follow up on Karen's question. I think it is important to keep in mind that incorporating green infrastructure into whatever process we're talking about is great, but it's not the same as allowing the development of projects that will protect natural resources just because we want to protect the natural resources, which is also really important. And so I'm hoping any process that's developed either by the TAC or by the great work that you folks are doing will also fully allow consideration of a project that is just being done to protect natural resources, like buying out a bunch of property and getting rid of the infrastructure to allow wetland migration, for example. And so we have to keep in mind that just allowing for consideration of the use of green infrastructure, which is generally designed to protect some gray infrastructure like a home or a road, is not the same as specifically designing projects to protect natural resources. Thanks.
Good point. So again, I'm being mindful of the time here. There are two questions I have for Anne and Elizabeth and Tanya, I guess. First, let me start with the question, or reiterate my request for the particulars of the prep process as quickly as possible, even if accepting that they are draft and still a work in progress, letting the subcommittee members have a chance to review them will significantly inform our discussions going forward. So the sooner that can happen, the better, ideally sometime later this week, so that I can get another meeting of this group scheduled in about 2 weeks to put that together with things we've already begun to think about. And then, Ann, the question for you is Dewberry. When can this subcommittee sit, meet, talk, and ask questions of the Dewberry folks?
Carl, this is Tanya. I think maybe I want to make sure you know we have heard loud and clear your request for that as soon as possible. And we've had some back chatter around this. And I think, you know, we need to put our heads together about how quickly we can get this to you, but it's loud and clear. We will be aiming to get this to you just as quickly as we can, some kind of preliminary draft with all the caveats that will be needed.
Yeah, that's fine. It's not something I think we're going to do anything with other than review and discuss within the subcommittee so that we can meaningful comments back to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Carl.
And Carl, you can, whenever we can schedule an initial call with you and your vice chair and Dewberry, we're happy to do that. And we're going to start out in that context so that we aren't breaking FOIA rules, just to kind of get a sense where everybody is. Then as soon as you're ready to schedule a subcommittee meeting and have a broader conversation, we're happy to do that too. So Dewberry's ready to do that.
Okay, so I am tentatively looking at a 2-week interval here before this subcommittee reconvenes. In the meantime, I would invite subcommittee members to email me directly with any questions, comments, or things they want to know about the Dewberry relationship as quickly as possible. And then Ann, Kristen and I will get to you probably within 2 days to see if we can't set up a time to talk with the Dewberry folks. He says, on behalf of Kristen, without ever asking her anything.
It's okay. I'm good with that.
Oh, good. Okay. Are there any other questions, comments? I don't think I see any other hands. I'm assuming your hand is from before, Karen. And if not, then we'll go ahead and wrap this up. Josh, let's try and get a meeting scheduled for this group in 2 weeks, which would be at the same time, unless I hear some really difficult problems from people. So that would put us on the April 20th, Tuesday, April 20th, for about an hour and a half to discuss what we just heard and where people's thinking is leading them.
That'll begin at 10 a.m., Carl?
Yes, please.
Very good. I am unclear at the moment if it's Dewberry or I who sets that up, but we will have it done in short time. Thank you.
Okay.
So, Carl, I think I heard pieces.
I'm sorry?
Are you talking about setting up your next subcommittee meeting, or this is Ann? I'm
Yes.
sorry. Are you talking
Yes.
about setting up your next subcommittee meeting, or are you talking? Yeah. Okay. So that's not the same as the initial call with you and Kristen and Josh. So we'll set that. I will set that initial call up with you and Kristen and Josh.
Okay.
Correct. Separate.
Very good. All right. Any other last comments from anybody?
I'd like to
If
say
not,
thank you. Thank you for the
I was just
opportunity
gonna-
to present this morning.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you and Tanya and your team for taking the time to put this together and for the work that you've done. I think that it holds some real promise for, one, accelerating our initial efforts here to get something useful before the TAC, and hopefully, ultimately, our input back can be used to better sync all of our efforts. Well, thank you very much. Thank you all, committee members, subcommittee members, and please mark your calendars for 2 weeks from today. And again, if you have comments or questions for the Dewberry folks, please email me directly.
Thanks all.
Anything else? That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much.